Thank you for being here. It's a great joy always to be with this group of people. Let me lay out for you what I hope we will accomplish tonight, tomorrow night, and then the two sessions Sunday morning. It's basically a three-part approach to this thing. The core of our study, being the center subject there, is the Quran, the Word of God. But I have found it helpful for the average American who is largely ignorant of what is Islam, who is Muhammad, what's this all about. In fact, most Americans probably had no interest in studying this matter until 9/11. That's piqued our interest, and there's a lot that's happened since then. So I think it's important for us to take a look at this, and especially as it relates to our religion. Our final session will deal with the compatibility of Islam and Christianity. But let's begin by going back in history and look at this period of history that essentially brought to the world's attention this religion of Islam. And to do that, you really have to go back and look at Muhammad. But I want you to observe that as Islam has expanded across the world, that the most populous Islamic nations on earth are not in the Middle East. The most populous one is Indonesia, which is really a bunch of islands. But look at Pakistan. That was formerly a part of India until it broke away and formed its own nation. So the largest Muslim populations are in countries largely in Southeast Asia and that vicinity. Look at the religious complexion of the world. Have you ever thought about this? That so far the majority religion in the world is Christianity. However, that's a very broad term. That would include anything and everything that flies under the name of Christianity and Christ. 1 billion of those being Catholic. But notice that there are 1 billion Hindus on the planet. There are 1 billion people that claim to be non-religious. So atheists, agnostics, humanists, skeptics, those who claim no affiliation with religion. They don't believe in religion. They don't believe in any spiritual concepts as it relates to afterlife and so forth. And then you have about 1 billion that include Buddhism and other mainly Asian religions. That makes then Islam the number 2 religion on the planet with over 1 billion adherents. If you look at the United States population of Muslims, there's only 1/4 of those that are of actual Arab descent, the majority being of Southeast or South Central Asian, an African-American population. We won't really have time to talk about the Nation of Islam, which is really kind of an offshoot of Orthodox traditional Islam and really not in many ways to be equated with traditional Islam. Well, some have suggested this is the fastest growing religion in our country. I haven't been able to verify that, but it is certainly growing and making extensive encroachments into American culture. For example, the United States Post Office has even dedicated a stamp to 2 parts of a Islamic festival. Mosques have been springing up in our country from one coast to the other. Here is the one at Ground Zero. I did a little research before coming here, and I think these are accurate. At the current time, there are some 126 mosques in the state of Florida. So in the last 30 to 40 years, over 2,000 mosques have been built in our country. Look carefully at this chart, which is really about a decade old now. There's not any new figures out yet. But notice that if you went back to 1940, you would have been hard-pressed to find a mosque in the United States. And notice when the mushroom came. Post-60s moving into the 70s. Is that coincidental? What happened in our nation after World War II? Well, our people began moving away from our traditional American values. That is, Bible values, the Christian worldview. That's always characterized our nation. Well, whenever a civilization, a culture shifts like that, moves away from those moorings, especially moorings that we believe to have been on track, then what would you expect to follow? What fills the vacuum, the void? Well, alternate ideologies and philosophies and religions. That's exactly what we're seeing. You could look at other religions and see the same thing. Buddhism, Hinduism, across our nation. Look how many Muslims in our country are of foreign birth. And you've listened to the news, surely, over the last few years, where school systems across our nation are incorporating Islamic teaching, usually because the Muslim population is clamoring for it to be done. Students being role-playing various Islamic roles and so forth. Kansas City Airport, not very long ago, put in foot baths for the Muslim cabbies. Universities all over our country, universities that would not even begin to give the time of day to Christianity. If you and I walked into a university and said, we really think you need to set aside at least one room on this campus for Christianity, what would you be met with? And yet at taxpayer expense, there are accommodations being made for Islam all over our nation. I went to the state of Michigan official state website, and their documents are in English and Spanish and Arabic. That's the extent to which encroachments have occurred in that country. Do you remember September 25th, 2009? If your grandparents were alive today and you showed them a picture of thousands of Muslims gathered on the lawn of the nation's capital engaging in Islamic prayer, what do you suppose they would say to you if they were here tonight? Well, of course, they would not believe that this has happened. Were our grandparents and great-grandparents racist? I don't think so. Were they prejudiced? I don't think so. They just understood that there are different religions and they can't all be from God, can they? They cannot all be from God. And therefore, they would insist that this is a misdirection of our nation. Would they be for persecuting? Would the founders of our civilization be for persecuting those who embrace non-Christian religion? No. No, they would not. But number one, they would not want accommodation given to it. They sure would want it taught in schools. They would think, what are you, insane that you would turn your children over to alternative ideologies and allow them to be indoctrinated? What's wrong with you? Show me one Muslim nation on earth where you can go and have Christianity taught in the public school. It doesn't happen, and we wouldn't expect it to. But we seem to have lost our sensibilities about the critical importance of such matters. And so I think they would suggest that we are moving in a direction that is ultimately detrimental to the survival of the cultural atmosphere that was created by our predecessors. Well, what is this religion that's become the second largest in the world? Well, I believe to answer that, you've really got to go look back at the life of Muhammad. Muhammad was born in AD 570. So that's over 500 years after Jesus came to the planet and then returned to heaven. He was born in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. If you were to take a look at a globe and see Africa and the Arabian Peninsula close by, and here is the Red Sea. Notice then that, Mount Sinai in Palestine up in this area, Iran is kind of to the east, and Iraq to the north of Saudi Arabia, and Mecca is situated very close to the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea down here at the bottom. So that kind of gives you an orientation geographically as to where this all took place. Muhammad's father actually died before he was born, and his mother died when he reached the age of 6. He grew up like a typical Bedouin child, tending livestock, learning the weapons of war, which of course in Arabia would have been a sword, perhaps a bow and a spear. He traveled at an early age with kinsmen on trading expeditions that crisscrossed the Arabian Peninsula. When he was 25 years old, he took charge of a caravan that was owned by a very wealthy widow woman, Khadija. She was 40 years old. And he so conducted himself in his responsibilities with regard to her caravan that she offered herself in marriage to him. And so he married her. He was 25, she was 40. This enabled him to have a period of, he suddenly came into money. So he was able to do a lot more things than he would have been able to do otherwise. Here is a satellite NASA view of Mecca and environs, a very rugged, deserty, barren part of the world. In AD 610, at the age of 40, so 15 years after his marriage occurred, he was out kind of what we would call vacation outside of town. He had gone up into a mountain range nearby, and there was so much heat, of course, in that part of the world that he took respite in a cave on Mount Hira. And there he claims, inside this cave, to have been visited by the angel Gabriel, who delivered to him a revelation from God. The Arabic word for God is Allah. And this revelation was the first of 114 revelations given over the next 23 years, all through the angel of revelation, according to Islam, Gabriel. After his death, in about 20 years, all of this was collected together, placed into a single volume called Al-Quran, the recitation, the reading, that which is recited orally is kind of the idea there. If you were to pick up a Quran, which is about the size of a New Testament, and begin reading, one of the things I think you would be immediately struck by is the extent to which the book spends time and effort denouncing the belief in many gods. That is a central theme of the Quran. And what's unique about that at this point in history, at least in Arabia, you have to understand that Arabia was very idolatrous, very similar to the Jews in Palestine back in the Old Testament. They lived in an idolatrous atmosphere where there was a lot of paganism and belief in many deities. Well, so initially his central message was, there's one God. Well, when he preached that, immediately hostilities commenced. Because you see, his hometown tribe, the Quraysh, were keepers of the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a cube-like structure that is situated in Mecca. And here's what Muslims believe about this facility. They claim that it was built at the very beginning of time, no doubt with the assistance of Adam, who was the first Muslim, and that it was destroyed in the flood. It was then rebuilt by Abraham and his son Ishmael, that Muslims believe was the son that Abraham offered up, and that God ordered pilgrimage to be made to this location by all good Muslims. And yet over time it fell into perverse use and became a shrine dedicated to polytheism, to many gods. And therefore, for Muhammad to challenge polytheism and to insist that there's one God, well, notice immediately that would bring him into conflict with his hometown tribe and the fact that the local economy was very closely tied to polytheism, because Arabs would make pilgrimage from all over Arabia to this location. So naturally that, enriches the locals, enhances the local economy, and he was tampering with that. So already he is developing for himself a number of enemies, and over the next few years this began to intensify to the point that he finally was forced to flee to Medina. Because as he made converts, initially among young people and slaves, that, of course, began to threaten the local population more and more as far as their perception of his influence. And so he was forced to flee for his life, which he did, and went about a 12-day camel ride by that day's assessment to the north, to an adopted city. Once again, going to satellite NASA photo. Here is Medina, and notice this almost in the center of the town, certainly a very visible, striking object. At night it stands out as a very prominent feature of this geographical area. Well, that is the Mosque of the Prophet When Muhammad arrived there, he immediately gave orders for the construction of a mosque, and of course, it continued to undergo construction over many years, even after his death. He is, in fact, buried beneath this green dome, and it is quite a magnificent structure with a number of minarets, which we'll describe in maybe tonight if we get to it. But this certainly is a critical location. It would be considered the number 2 most holiest site in Islam, next to Mecca itself. Let me give you a very brief, very swift overview of Muhammad's life. I mentioned to you that he married Khadijah, who died in the year AD 619. He was completely monogamous up to this point. That was his only wife. Later that year, he claims to have experienced Al-Miraj, which was an actual trip to heaven. I hope tonight to explain that to you as well. I do not mean by that he left this earth, went to heaven, never returned. I mean he made a trip to heaven and came back to the earth. Then within a year, he claims that he was ordered to marry, he was ordered by an angel, by God, to marry his best friend Abu Bakr's daughter, Aisha. She was 6 years old at the time. I'll talk about that a little more later. Then in another 2 years, the intensity of persecution in Mecca caused him to flee to Medina. Now, this is a critical year in Islamic history. It, in fact, constitutes to them the center of human history. In the same way that the Christian world gauges all time based upon the birth of Christ. So everything prior to that is BC, everything after that is AD, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Everything's hinged on the birth of Christ in the Christian world, but not in Islamic countries. They go with our AD 622 because this is the year that Muhammad fled to Medina. Consequently, as you read through the Quran, there are surahs that are very clearly, surah being the term used to refer to one of these 114 separate revelations. There are some that clearly indicate a Mecca context and some that indicate a Medina context. Well, having shifted then to Medina, where there was already a little Muslim population that had heard his teaching and converted, plus he brought with him from Mecca most of his converts. They too fled due to persecution. So from Medina, a number of things began to occur. In the first place, there was a already existing Jewish population in Medina. Isn't that interesting? I can only assume that these were there as a result of the Babylonian captivity, the scattering of the Old Testament Jews. Now, this is several hundred years later. Remember in Acts chapter 2, when Jews came from, according to Acts 2:5, every nation under heaven. Do you remember those 16 or 17, 14 nations that are mentioned there? One of them is Arabia. So there was a Jewish population in Arabia that if you looked at them for all practical purposes, they were Arabs. They spoke Arabic. They were part of that culture. And yet distinct because they were Jews. And they typically were the wealthier citizens, and they had actually in Medina built what we would call fortresses that they used for protection. And so when Muhammad arrived on the scene, one of his first points to them was, hey, I am the logical and actual sequel to your religion. I am one of these prophets in a line of prophets that includes, Moses and Joshua and Jesus. All of these prophets were my predecessors, but I am the last and final prophet of Allah. And therefore he was seeking to affiliate and identify himself with that Jewish tradition, but that did not go over with them. I mean, after all, he descended from Ishmael, did he not? And they descended from Isaac. So almost from the get-go, hostilities commenced. In fact, armed conflicts. And I'm telling you, they had some serious fighting between his followers and the Jewish tribes. In the meantime, he was having to engage in armed conflict with other Arab tribal groups scattered around the peninsula who had close kinships with his hometown tribe of Quraysh. At this point in Arabic history, they're very tribal-oriented. And therefore, blood feuds was a big thing. Americans have trouble identifying with the mindset of many Muslim countries. When we watch on TV and see how they conduct themselves in the streets and so forth, that's just not the way Americans typically act. Now, some of us kind of did in the 60s with all that marching and everything in the street, but generally Americans are a little more genteel, shall I say. I don't mean that in an offensive way. But these tribal groups, they would go after and shed blood anybody that offended one of their individuals that's perceived to be part of their family or their tribal group. And then, of course, even though he had fled from his hometown of Mecca, his hometown tribe wasn't willing to let him go, let it end there. And so they actually mounted military assaults. By this time, of course, his converts had increased. He was able to amass a fairly effective military force, an army. And so they would come from Mecca and try to attack him, and he would go out in battle and attack them. So you've got all this fighting going on among Jews and Arabs and his hometown tribe. Of course, he continues to expand. There are more and more people. He's making more converts. It's spreading across Arabia and eventually even beyond. During this period, he became polygamous. He began adding women to his harem and would build additional quarters for them adjacent to the mosque, which was also under construction. He claims, of course, throughout this period to have continued to receive revelations from Allah. By the year AD 630, his military capability had increased to such an extent that he was able to march his army back to his hometown and bring it into submission. By the way, the word Islam means submission. Muslim, hear those two words? Islam, Muslim, from the same word, means one who submits. He literally went back to his hometown and caused them to accept his religious thinking. He cleansed the Kaaba of all of its idolatrous elements, all of its idols, engaged in some other activities there, cleaned up the town, so to speak, eliminated opposition, and then returned to Medina. He never actually moved back to Mecca and lived there. 2 years later, in this annual pilgrimage, he returned with his fellow Muslims for what turned out to be his farewell pilgrimage. Because after that, within just a few months, he died at the age of 62 of an unknown illness. I don't think any Muslim scholars have even tried to say they knew what it was for sure. But that ended his life. Now let me try to scope and summarize very quickly what's happened in the Islamic world since then. Well, when Muhammad died, there immediately was, shall we say, not only tremendous concern among Muslims. In fact, it took them by surprise. They were shocked. They were stunned. They really didn't anticipate this, that their religious leader would just unexpectedly die somewhat prematurely. Then they began to remember that he had made some statements about the effect that, someday he's going to die like everybody else, and they need to be prepared for that. So they calmed down. But then the issue was, well, who's going to take his place? What do we do now? And of course, Muslims to this day are adamant that Muhammad was the last prophet of God on the planet. There were no others, and there will be no others, they claim. So it's not like they're trying to find a successor to Muhammad in terms of a prophet, but they felt that they needed to replace him with some sort of a community leader that could kind of, organize and guide the Islamic community. Well, there immediately began to be friction over that. Who do you pick? Well, they managed to cause that friction initially to subside, because there was a lot of support for Muhammad's best friend, Abu Bakr. He had been with Muhammad from the very beginning. Muhammad had married his daughter, Aisha. So he was able to serve in the capacity of Khalifa, the Arabic word for caliph, sort of a vice regent, a community leader. And then when he passed on. There was another momentary, and some differences of opinion, but it finally settled on Omar. You've heard people who have the name Omar. Umar, that's an Arabic name, goes back to this man. That's why it's prominent even in our own country. And he too had been with Muhammad from the very beginning, and therefore was viewed as very close to the situation, and he served in this capacity for about a decade. And then he was replaced by Uthman. Now, during each of these individuals, Islam is expanding. By now, the military is composed of many thousands. And they have not only basically conquered Arabia, they have moved over into North Africa. Even to this day, there are a number of Muslim countries right across North Africa. They moved up further north into Turkey, which today is Islamic, which at that time was the Persian Empire. And they subdued it and brought it under submission. They moved over toward Indonesia and up, knocked on the door, so to speak, of Russia. Islam was expanding during these, 2 decades or so, 3? But at this point in Islamic history, that friction that commenced at the death of Muhammad escalated and came to a head. The disagreement over who should be selected as the Islamic community leader reached its climax. Here was the disagreement. There were those who said the Islamic leader should be able to trace his direct blood ancestry right back to Muhammad. He should be a descendant of Muhammad. These individuals became known as Shiites, from the Arabic word Shia, which is the idea of being a party or partisan to an individual, specifically Ali, who could trace his ancestry right back to Muhammad. When Ali died, his 2 sons, notice these names, Hassan and Hussein, both of whom died violent deaths. A lot of really bad fighting went on at this period, many times as it is today between Shiite and the alternative. They use, even to this day, terms like imams and ayahs. Remember the Ayatollah Khomeini? Ayahs, as the expressions they use for their religious leaders and teachers. Now the other group, these were the ones who said, no. The community leader does not have to be directly connected to Muhammad. They can just be someone who has such prominence that they are selected by community consent. So they became known as Sunnis, and their first leader was this fellow, and then there followed a number of what we would call dynasties. They call them caliphates, that lasted for any number of years through a series of leaders. And finally culminating in what we would call the Ottoman Empire. There were caliphs, sultans, sheiks. And the Ottoman Empire was really in history kind of the pinnacle of Islam, period, kind of a Renaissance period. If you go back and look at that, they made some advancements in architecture and medicine and some different things. And then it seems to me that Islam has waned since then. For all practical purposes, the Ottoman Empire came to an end at the end of World War I. And then we didn't hear much about Islam until, and I would suggest to you that we are literally living. It's hard to see when you're close in history. You've got to get away from it a few years, and we're not there yet. But I believe we're going to look back at this period and see that suddenly we are seeing another significant upsurge of the influence of Islam. You know, back there when it was really making progress, you remember that not only did it spread across North Africa, but it began to make encroachments into Europe itself, which historically has been, apart from Palestine, it has, of course, Muslims took over Palestine, but historically Christianity in its broad sense has focused in Europe. And Islam began to assert itself, and those armies, they were very effective and powerful, and if it had not been for a general by the name of Martel that stopped the Islamic advance at the Pyrenees Mountains, then history would have been very different. And I do not think that I don't think it's inconsequential that Islam is making tremendous inroads into European culture. Germany, France, England, Holland, and doing so without firing a shot. I think big things are happening in our day. I cannot overemphasize the significance, the magnitude of this division that exists in Islam. Many Muslims will try to downplay that and act like, oh no, Islam, we're all united, we're all Muslims, we all believe the same thing. That's not true. This is a major division. And so often the American media, I believe, misrepresents what's happening, even in Iraq. You know, Iraq's been painted us pretty much as we're the aggressors, we've come in and been mean to those people, and they all pretty much hate us and want us out. That's not exactly accurate. There is a lot of bloodshed still going on in Iraq over these two different viewpoints. In fact, it's so extensive that when we removed Saddam Hussein, who was Sunni, however, Iraq is 60% Shiite. So Saddam Hussein, being the brutal dictator that he was keeping the majority population under his thumb, forcibly. We took him out of the way and very naively, I think, stepped in and said, okay, now we're going to help you have what we have. Everybody come to the table, and this is going to be democratic, and everybody gets their piece of the pie. So the Shiites said, yeah, and since we're the majority, we get to run the country. Well, the other side wasn't about to let that happen, so they've been fighting and will continue to do so. The number one most populous nation on earth as far as Shiite is concerned is Iran. That's where the greatest concentration of Shiites are in the world. Now, don't let anybody tell you that there haven't been divisions in Islam, just like there's been divisions in Christendom. Many different divisions. We don't have time to look at all of these. The Sunnis have split over any number of issues. There was a fellow that came along about 100 years ago named Wahhabi. You know, his attitude was, we need to go back to Islam in its golden age, when it was Arabic. And he advocated warlike jihad. And the Saudi royal family is heavily influenced by Wahhabism. If you were to take a look at the world's population as it relates to Islam, in broad terms, if we were to just kind of round off and speak in broad terms, when you think of the Islamic world, about 10% are Shiite, 90% are Sunni. So that's a very important observation to grasp in sorting out what is happening in the world today. Now let's move quickly and answer this question. Why does there seem to be such hostility between America, Christians in general, and what we are told is a minority radical element in Islam? I don't necessarily subscribe to that idea. But what is the problem here? Why is there friction? Why can't we get along? Why can't we coexist? We seem to be having trouble doing that. Now, I suggest to you three reasons. Back in the Middle Ages, which lasted for 1,000 years, we call them the Dark Ages, don't we? Started about 500 AD and lasted till about 1500 in the Renaissance. But back in the kind of the middle era there, about 1,000, there were Europeans got it in their mind. We need to go back to the Holy Lands and retake them for Christ, because infidels, isn't that interesting? Both sides call each other infidels. But infidels have taken over the Holy Land. And by the way, think about that. The Jews occupied that land before the Muslims did. They took it, well, they really didn't. They occupied it, according to the Bible, as God expelled their predecessors. He expelled them, and He gave a very specific reason: because of their immorality, abject immorality, iniquity, paganism, and gave that land then to the Jews. And God said, it's not because you deserve it or anything, Deuteronomy 7, but I'm giving it to you. So they occupied it for a good long while, and Islam did not come in and take it over until, as I said, centuries after Christ left the planet. But here are these fellows in Europe, Germany and England and France, and they go over there, and what do they have on their shirts? Crosses. And I'm telling you, there were several crusades. Most all of them were unsuccessful. I think at one time they were somewhat successful, but then Saladin, the famous Muslim Saracen general, ran him back out. But I'm telling you that the average person who grows up in an Islamic country anywhere in the world, they have been taught, so far as I can tell, they have been taught that Christians at one time came to their countries and began killing them. It was obvious that their goal was to exterminate Muslims. And I don't think you can get that out of the consciousness, the worldview of many Islamic countries. Now notice that America didn't have anything to do with that. America did not even exist. But we are credited with kind of being the ultimate of all of that. That's so much so that Osama bin Laden, you remember in one of those communiques that would show up every once in a while mysteriously and they'd decipher it and everything, he referred to us as the Crusader. I bet that just went over most people's head. That was a flag, a buzzword he was using there. We're kind of the leader of those who are trying to exterminate Islam. Well, that's just not fair. True Christianity that's taught in the New Testament would never approve of what happened in the Crusades. But boy, it's a long time dying. And by associating us with that, I don't know what it would take to convince the Islamic world that that's an unfair characterization of us, for sure, perhaps even Europe. Number two, do you remember Hitler during World War II? Of course we remember. We were all alive then, weren't we? Well, bless their hearts. I wish there were more World War II people still alive. But among the things that Hitler did, you remember, was to persecute Jews in a number of those countries, Poland and Germany and elsewhere. Killed a lot of them, but a number of them escaped. And they left Europe, and they really kind of came over toward us, and I guess we kind of waved them aside. And yet, with our backing and with the backing of England and some other countries, they sailed down to Palestine, and they went ashore and carved out kind of a niche, so to speak, and formed the modern state of Israel in May of 1948. Well, it's not like the land was no longer populated. There were people living there. They're called Palestinians, and of course they were all Muslim. And consequently, once again, embedded into the Islamic consciousness of the world, we are the ones who literally stepped in there, right in keeping with the Crusades, and took that land, and we back Israel. We give them money every year, millions of dollars. We've helped them with their military capability, and on it goes. We have been politically, we are very close allies with Israel. It's been that way from the beginning. And so from their perspective, from the Islamic perspective, they're not ever going to trust us. You can have all the meetings you want at Camp David or whatever. I don't believe that that's going to change their thinking. The only way the only way probably you could change their thinking, if then, is for there to be a public announcement to the whole world. We are no longer allies with Israel. We're not going to have anything to do with them. We're no longer their friends. We're not going to help them. Now, I don't know, practically speaking, how that would play out, if it would be any better, but it would definitely send a message to them that would be shocking, I think, to the Islamic world. They don't envision that happening. You have the fact that not only is there this political tie that's very strong and very deep, you have a religious tie there too. Because you see a sizable segment of Christendom believes that Israel, in its modern form, is still God's chosen people. How many televangelists have you heard over the years? And I mean, they're adamant. They say we must support Israel. If we don't, in fact, God will punish us. We will be an enemy of God if we don't. Well, I don't happen to subscribe to that understanding of Scripture. I believe the Bible's very clear about this, and I believe Christendom has missed it as they've missed several other critical New Testament doctrines. I don't have time to go into all that, but let me just give you some passages. Jot them down and go study and think about this. God never intended for anybody to get the idea that He is a racist, that He picks people out based on their ethnicity and then holds them up and gives them special favors that just because of their genetic connections. The Jews themselves got that idea. And you remember John the Baptizer's response to that when they came out there in Matthew 3? He said, Don't come out here telling me you're children of Abraham. That doesn't mean anything. God is able of these stones to raise up genetic descendants. That doesn't amount to anything. You see, the only reason why God ever singled out the Israelite nation, and by the way, He really singled out Abraham, that then caused him to have to commit himself to the genetic descendants, no matter how bad they acted. And there were many times that he just flat said, this is a rotten group, and I would have already dumped them if it had not been for the promise I made back there to Abraham. Now, he said that. But he did that for one reason. It was because he was bringing Christ into the world. That's it. That is the reason. So he never intended to leave the impression, well, if you're born genetically a Jew, well, hey, you're good with God. Everything, you're good to go. That is not true. Every single individual in human history is on a level field before God. They're all obligated to respond to God, and if they don't, they'll be lost. Doesn't matter what their connections are racially. And notice how that comes to climax in the book of Romans. That is made very clear there. Look at the last two verses of Romans 2, where Paul emphatically says, today there is no person who is a Jew physically. The only Jews today in God's sight are those that are Jews spiritually. Circumcision is of the heart, not the flesh. That's pretty clear, isn't it? And even went so far in Galatians 6:16 to refer to the church of Christ as the Israel of God. We don't have time to go into more detail, but there's passage after passage after passage. Somehow Christendom has taken a turn on that, and consequently you have this widespread religious support of Israel. That only exacerbates this issue as far as the religious or the Islamic world is concerned. Number 3, so far as I can tell, another reason why Muslims typically think that we should hate America and oppose America is because of Western decadence, of which we are perceived to be the leader. And they've got a lot of good evidence for that. Not the least of which is when what arguably is the most powerful, visible politician on earth, the President of the United States, stands up in front of the world and makes an announcement that is unprecedented in human history. Marriage between 2 men or 2 women, that's good to go. That's okay. Now, Muslims have their own ethical issues, but don't you see that just sent moral shockwaves around the planet? I mean, even Russia stood up and said, not here. So we are seen as kind of decadent, ladies. Their women, and they got a lot of issues with their women as far as what they've imposed upon them. We'll talk about that tomorrow night. They view themselves as modest, and they view Western women as immodest. Their boys come over here and go to our universities and see girls with their body parts hanging out to view, and they seem very promiscuous, very open. Well, hey, I'm not misrepresenting things because, again, if our grandparents were here and they saw how the American woman is dressing out in public, they would be shocked. Women are wearing things in public now that in 1950 they would have been arrested for. And it's on TV, it's everywhere. So, come on, they got a pretty good, in fact, I kind of agree with them on all these. They don't have a very good view of America because of these issues. So that's a point of clarification. Now, what is Islam? When people talk about Islam, the religion of Islam, what are they talking about? If somebody were to ask you, what is the religion of Christ? Can you in 5 minutes tell me what Christianity is? You could do that. It centers on Christ. Who was Christ? What did He do? And then what's involved in living the Christian life? How do you worship God according to Christianity? Man, you could whip that out quick, couldn't you? How do you become a Christian? You could whip that out real quick. Well, what's involved in living Christianity? Well, you could very quickly talk about Christian morality, proper behavior, how to treat your neighbor, how husbands, wives, parents, children. It's really not that hard, is it? You could lay out all of these basic doctrines of what it means to be a Christian. Well, Islam can do this too. somewhat unlike many religions of the world. They themselves have indicated we have 5 pillars, 5 fundamental doctrines that kind of constitute the skeleton and much of what Islam is. Beginning with the Shahada or Shahadas, there are 2 oral testifications, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, Muhammadun Rasulallah, Muhammad is his prophet. Muslims believe when you make that oral testification, when you believe that and say that, that's conversion day. You're a Muslim. That's how it's done. It's interesting to me that a religion would speak of the necessity of belief in God, but also to emphasize one out of many prophets, a whole string of prophets, and make that religion dependent upon oral acknowledgement of one of those. You know, that would be, I guess, a Christian, to be a parallel, we would say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I believe that Paul was one of his apostles. Well, that's certainly true, but why would that be one of the oral, why would you focus on that as being a central concept that must be affirmed to the exclusion of all others? So, again, without any knowledge of Islam, that raised a question in my mind very quickly that I think the average Muslim doesn't see any problem with that. But it is true they believe that Muhammad was the ultimate and quintessential prophet and man. Number 2, salat. That's the prayer that occurs 5 times a day. Why 5? Why not 4? Why not 6? Why not emphasis placed upon private prayer? And it's not. There's 5 official prayers per day. We'll talk about that momentarily, but this is preceded by a call to prayer. You go through ritual ablution. I'll explain all of that to you. And on Fridays is community mosque worship. Psalm, these are the Arabic terms. Psalm is the Ramadan fast. You know, they're on a lunar calendar, and so their months slowly shift around the calendar. So Ramadan has occurred all the way around the calendar. This is a full month of observance that consists of fasting during the daylight hours only. When the sun goes down, you can eat all you want. Now again, I mean no disrespect. Really, I don't. I'm trying to be as unbiased as I can and make observations. If your child decided to start a religion, don't you imagine that child would say, okay, one of the tenets of our religion is donuts for breakfast every day and candy anytime you want it. You know, that's just humans. If we have a chance to make up something, you're going to see riddled through it things that humans would do. What is the point of fasting during the daylight hours? You know, most Americans don't eat breakfast. They're on the run. They probably eat some lunch or skip lunch and maybe some supper, but don't eat anything until the sun goes down. Then you can eat all you want and get up early before dark, before light, and eat a big breakfast. Where I don't understand the value of that, the sense of it, but that is Ramadan. And there are many exceptions, by the way. Illness, pregnancy, old age. All of these are reason to exempt oneself from these requirements. The Hajj, this is that pilgrimage to Mecca which can be made any number of times, but there is an annual, yearly pilgrimage that Muslims from all over the world participate in when, thousands, perhaps millions converge upon Mecca in order to basically engage in certain rituals that are associated with this religion. Each one of these little white points is a person. One of the things they do is circumambulate. That is, they move counterclockwise around the Kaaba in mass, just kind of moving around it. Remember when Malcolm X converted to a form of Islam? He went over there and participated in that, and so there's some other things they do, throwing stones at the devil, some other things that not necessarily for us to go through, but it's kind of an annual worldwide event. And by the way, again, Islam would say that while every Muslim ought to try to do this at least once in their lifetime, once again, distance, money, health could prevent that from occurring, and that's okay. Zakah is the religious tax in Muslim countries. In a Muslim country where Christians and Jews have been subjugated, they are placed under a heavier tax, but the average Muslim gives about 3% of his annual income. Let's talk about the mosque in Arabic, masjid, and see what this is about. What are we talking about here? What is this religion as it relates to its structures? The Arabic word means a place of prostration. If you were to go to an Islamic country anywhere in the world, you would be stunned, an American would be stunned to see mosques as plentiful as church buildings in our country. It's rare for you to see a mosque in our country unless one's been built near you in your community. But in Islamic countries, they are prominent. And whenever they meet in the mosque as a community, they go through very specific rituals. Now, a mosque to the Muslim is not equivalent to a church building in the American or Western mindset. It generally is a large structure. It has certain features that I'm going to show you in just a moment. Typically has an open compound in the middle. So if terrorists run into a mosque, they're not running into a church building per se. They could be going into a large structure and even be placing themselves in the open compound. Several features of a mosque that I want to just introduce you to very quickly. One of the most strikingly visible, I think, and very interesting, even beautiful features of a mosque in an Islamic country, you don't see a lot of it here, but it's starting to pop up in places, is this very tall tower, not in any way associated with what some denominational people consider a prayer tower. This is the location, it's called the minaret. This is the location from which the muezzin, the prayer caller, calls the Islamic community to prayer. If you go to any Islamic country and spend the night, you will hear this call occurring loud enough where it can be heard across the neighborhood, across the community. There is a specific individual assigned with this responsibility, although in some more modern countries they'll use a recording. But they'll typically, if there is an actual person doing it, they'll use a loudspeaker, and it sounds out all across the area. This goes all the way back to Muhammad. The muezzin would stand up on the roof of the mosque or whatever he had at the time it was constructed, and he would deliver the adhan, which is the same in every Islamic country, again going all the way back to the beginning, and it's done in Arabic. If you were to listen to this, the Western ear, it's kind of eerie because you've probably heard it and didn't know it, or maybe you've been in countries where you heard it. I'm not going to do it, but I want to give you an idea of what it sounds like. It sounds like he's going, that sort of thing. But he's actually saying words. Like the first line, Allah Akbar, which is a very poor job. But if you listen closely, they're pronouncing words. And twice they're saying, Allahu Akbar, Allah is most great. Twice, I testify there's no God save Allah. Twice, I testify Muhammad is the messenger. Come to the prayer, come to the success. Allah is most great. There is no God. So he sings this thing over, and the purpose of it is to cause all individuals, whatever they're doing in their business or life, to stop and to engage in prayers. If you were to go into a mosque, you would see a very prominent feature of any mosque, the mihrab, which is a kind of a niche. It's a kind of an enclave, and the purpose of that is to designate the Qibla, the Arabic word for direction of Mecca. You've heard that Muslims face Mecca wherever they are. If they're in a Walmart parking lot and stop, throw down their rug, and they're going to be facing toward Mecca, considered to be the most holy place in a mosque. Many mosques have a minbar, somewhat equivalent to a pulpit, but not exactly, but the community leader can address the Islamic community from that location. Then there is the ritual ablution that I said precedes prayers. That's called wudu. And it too is very ritualized, very specific. It consists of a sadarvan, an ablution fountain. And so wherever you go in the world where there's a mosque, they're going to have provision made for the means of using water, a ritual ablution. This is one of those was in the Philippines. They just have these little spigots, these little pipes coming out where the worshiper can engage in what is supposed to be engaged in. Again, very specific. It consists of washing the hands 3 times up to the wrist, rinsing the mouth 3 times, rinsing the nostrils 3 times, being careful during Ramadan not to swallow any water, washing the face with both hands 3 times, washing the right and left forearm from the fingers to the elbow 3 times, washing the head once by running both hands from the forehead to the nape of the neck, then back to the forehead, washing the ears with the index finger, washing the feet up to the ankle, first the right, then the left, 3 times each, and then making the oral testification. All of this is to precede prayer before actually going through the prayer ritual itself. Another observation that, again, this is just from the perspective of a Christian. You know, Jesus, there's always been a lot of rituals associated with human religion, correct? Any religion you go look at it, there's a lot of it. There's less of it in Christianity than any other religion. And there is no, what I would call, mindless activity. You know, if you want to call observance of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week a ritual, it's nevertheless a very meaningful event that it has very specific things attached to it, and it's not engaged in the same way that I consider to be ritualistic, like having beads that you finger, which, by the way, is included in Islam. That very same practice. If you were to go to a mosque, you would see the individuals going through salat. And again, very specific postures as oral statements are being made. The group will engage in a number of postures in the same order every time. It's always the same. It includes standing. It includes kind of what we would call a bow. Then there's the one that's so prominent, kind of prostrate, where you tuck your knees up under your chest and place your forehead on the floor. All Muslims engage in this in the same way, 5 times a day. Here are the Arabic words that designate when that's to occur. It occurs beginning at daybreak and then goes up, the last one being just after the sun has set. And again, if you go to your New Testament, here's a contrast, just a side point, that it's when you study the God of the Bible and acquaint yourself with Him, His behavior on earth over a period of centuries. Some of these rituals that characterize many religions would come under the category of commandments of men. It's not the kind of thing that God would require of humans. That's my contention, but it's a side point, so don't get hung up on that. Let me give you a few other details now about the life of Muhammad before we wind this up tonight. We'll have a Q&A if you want to stay for it. Here, in regard to things that Muhammad himself did in this world, just something for you to consider. These are things I've gleaned right out of Islamic sources. I'm not making any of this up. Would not in any way want to be guilty of misrepresenting any religion or anybody. Honestly, I don't want to do that. And I believe that I've been very careful to consult numerous Islamic sources to make sure that I was not being misled. Muslim scholars tell us that Muhammad led 27 military campaigns, planned and authorized 38 additional ones. Remember, I told you that even when he went to Medina, where he encountered these Jewish tribes, he ended up conquering them. One of the groups, one Jewish tribal group, was starved into submission behind their fortress, so they finally gave up. And his fellow Muslims commenced execution of these 700 plus Jewish men by beheading. It began in the morning and they completed the task by torchlight that evening. That's all part of Islamic history. Do you remember how many armies Jesus led into battle? Anybody remember the number? Number 2, to the Western mind, although less now than ever before, polygamy has always been considered by the Christian world as objectionable and immoral. Now, a Muslim who doesn't grasp Bible history would say, well, wait a minute, Abraham, there were a lot of great polygamy. We don't have time to discuss that in length, but that's not Christianity. Each man is to have his own wife, period. That's it. And if you go back and look at history, even in our own nation, the founders and courts adamantly insisted that will not be tolerated in our civilization. It cannot be. Because on it, one man, one woman marriage, on it civilization rests and depends. Well, Muhammad had as many as 12 wives at one time. Tomorrow I'll show you that the Quran allows a man up to 4. So how could Muhammad have 12? I've asked Muslims. Here's their answer. He's the prophet. Wrong answer. That's not the God of the Bible. God is impartial. He doesn't do that. I went to the Hadith because I had a young man from Egypt come up and challenge me in one of my seminars. And he said, oh, no, Aisha was not 6 years old when he married her. She was 18, I think he said. Well, Muslim scholars say she was 6 when she was betrothed. They did not marry and consummate the marriage until she was 9. The Hadith is a body of Arabic or Islamic literature that is right up next to the Quran. It's not the Quran, but it is held in high esteem. It is normative and regulative. And these hadith give information about Muhammad's life, how he combed his hair and things like that, because Muslims want to copy that. And I found a number of the hadith narrated by Aisha herself, in which she says that her parents turned her, or caused her to be to be engaged, if you put that from Arabic, at the age of 6. But notice she was a girl of 9 when she was handed by her mother, handed over to Muhammad. All of these are from the very prestigious collection of hadith by al-Bukhari. And all of them say the same thing. I've checked this out very carefully. Another incident in the life of Muhammad, he had a stepson who was married to a woman. And this stepson got it in his mind. He saw something kind of transpire, I guess, through the eyes between Muhammad and his wife. So in his mind, if the prophet wants my wife, that's fine. So he divorced her so that Muhammad could marry her. Muslim scholars, Muslim historians will just report this information to you very matter-of-factly. They don't see any issue there. But those who are educated in the spiritual principles of the Christian religion would find that eye-opening. Dr. Zakir Naik, who is a prominent Muslim debater from India, he says that most of Muhammad's wives' marriages were due for political reasons, like war widows that needed husbands to take care of them and so forth. I find it astounding. See, again, this shows how far apart in our thinking we are. He doesn't try to deny historically that Muhammad had many wives. That's not an issue. He just tries to justify why. So it's a point for the Christian world to consider. The Quran itself gives credence to the notion of spells. This is a story that the Muslim scholars tell. I'll tell you it very quickly. There were 2 Jewish sorceresses who cast a spell on Muhammad by means of some hair that they had acquired from Muhammad without him knowing about it. They took these hairs and tied them into knots on a sort of a palm branch. And as they tied each knot, there were 11 knots, they breathed an imprecation on each knot, cursing Muhammad, and then threw it into a dry well. And he became ill immediately and was lying on his deathbed. He was going to die. And he had a vision, he claims. God informed him the cause of this illness, being this palm branch with these knots. And so he instructed his followers where to go to get that palm branch. And then God, he says, gave him these 11 verses from the last 2 surahs of the Quran. And as they recited each verse, those knots, each knot would untie. And once they were all untied, Muhammad recovered from his illness and survived. Well, does the Bible ever give any indication of mythology, fable, outlandish tales? Yes, the Bible will report those to you as being things that some people believed. But the Bible never endorses such. It never places its stamp of approval on such. That is a contrast between the Bible and the Quran. Did you know that originally Muhammad faced toward Jerusalem, and all Muslims did when they prayed? Isn't that interesting? Why? And it's up to speculation. He doesn't claim to give the Quran that I read. Anywhere I've read in the Quran, there's no explanation why there. But when the Jews rejected him, he claims to have received revelation from God telling, okay, now you can turn to where you really wanted to turn all along anyways, which was Mecca. But doesn't that smack of why? Why? I mean, does God change like that on things? Did he not anticipate the need to shift to Mecca? What's going on there? And I know that the explanation that any Muslim has studied and would accept is acceptable to them. But as I read through and studied these things, I thought that smacks of inauthenticity. And then the final thing I want to show you tonight is Al-Miraj. Remember I mentioned to you that Muhammad claims to have made a trip to heaven. Let me relate this to you very quickly, honestly, as best as I can from the Muslim sources themselves. Here is the story. How many times have you seen this structure? It's in Jerusalem, isn't it? What's it called? Dome of the Rock. Began to be built during one of the rule periods of one of the Umayyad caliphs. Well, most people wouldn't know, okay, so what? It's a mosque. There's a lot of mosques. No. This is a very special mosque. If you looked at a cutaway of it, it's an octagon. It has an inner octagonal arcade and then a completely inner circular arcade. And if you could go inside of it and see these arcades and move to the very center, what you would then see is a lofty gold dome in the very center of, real gold. And beneath that gold dome, in the very center of the mosque, and the reason why the mosque was built, is a massive rock ledge called the Noble Rock. Muslims believe this is the rock from which Muhammad made his trip into heaven. Now let me tell you the details of this that, again, I have found in the Muslim sources. One night, Muhammad had difficulty sleeping. So he got up and went to the Kaaba. Not inside, just went to it, lay back down and fell asleep. The next thing he knew, he was being awakened by Gabriel. And when he looked around, he saw with Gabriel a heavenly winged creature that he said was not really a horse, it wasn't a mule. He didn't know what species it was just a heavenly creature. This creature has a name. Listen to me pronounce it. Barak. Muhammad says that Gabriel instructed him to get up on Barak, which of course he did. And with Gabriel standing with his hand on the creature and Muhammad astride, the three of them began to fly through the air. They flew from Mecca to Jerusalem. They paused there in their journey and encountered a number of the prophets of the Old Testament. Of course, Muslims would say these are Muslim prophets. We know them as Jewish prophets: Aaron, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Jesus. They had a conversation, by the way, that consisted of the prophets offering to Muhammad two bowls from which to drink. One, a bowl of wine, and one, a bowl of milk, and he wisely selected the milk. After that engagement and that interaction, the Muslim authorities say that Muhammad and Barak and Gabriel began to ascend through what the Quran calls the seven heavens. That's a separate study right there. 7 heavens? And about midway up, they encountered these same prophets that they had encountered in Jerusalem, but now they appeared in their heavenly celestial state. And then they considered their ascent, or continued their ascent, until they came up to what the Quran calls the Lot, L-O-T-E, Lot tree of the uttermost end. This was in fact the very presence of Allah. Allah spoke to Muhammad and informed him that he and his followers, he is to go back and enjoin upon his followers 50 prayers per day. He then left the presence of Allah and descended back down through the seven heavens until about halfway down or so, he came to Moses. If I might paraphrase the conversation, and I mean no disrespect. Moses said, "So, what did God want?" And he said, "He wants us to pray 50 prayers per day." Moses said, "That's too many. You can't pray that many prayers, let alone get your people to do it. You need to go back to God and ask for a reduction." Now, if Moses said that to you, what would you do? Well, he went back, and Allah reduced it to 40 prayers. As he was descending once again, Moses once again stopped him and said, "What happened?" "Well, 40 prayers." "That's too many. Your people are not spiritually minded enough to do that. You need to go back and ask for a reduction." I'm not making this up. This went on until finally it was reduced to 5 prayers. And you know, Moses again said, "That's too many." And Muhammad said, "I would be too embarrassed and ashamed to go back again. That's it." I'm telling you, that is the reason Muslims pray 5 prayers per day. That's the historical event that instituted and instigated that practice. He then returned to Jerusalem and then flew back to Mecca. All of this done in one night. What would take camel caravans like 2 weeks or more to do. He claims it all occurred in one night. Well, naturally, this raises some questions. One, why does a horse need wings? You say to fly. Well, no, not a creature that God creates. That's a human concept. Even the angels of the Bible don't have wings. I realize that medieval artists have planted that in people's minds. We even have songs, don't we? Popular songs about angels' wings and all that. That's a myth. Now, there are these classifications of the seraphim and the cherubim, but the seraphim of Isaiah 6, that's clearly figurative. He has 3 pairs of wings. That's figurative. All the angels of the Bible always appeared in adult male form. They look like humans. The notion of angels having wings, what, to fly from heaven to here? Like that's necessary? Well, apply that concept to this. Why would he have wings? Why does a horse even have a name? Now, again, I'm not suggesting to you that I'm making any sort of a conclusive argument. I'm not. I'm just making observations. This is not where I'm putting my weight down. We're going to study the Quran itself tomorrow night. But these are just things as I was studying that are taught in Islamic history. I thought, wow, look at this. These raise questions, serious questions in my mind. Why would you, if you're going to go visit God from Mecca, why would you go to Jerusalem first? Why do that? Is there some desire to associate yourself, a name-dropping type of situation? Why meet up with Abraham and others? What's the point there? And if you had an opportunity to come into the presence of Allah, why would the conversation center on the number of prayers? Does that not... I just hear a person thinking, well, why not? What else? Well, wait a minute. Think through this. Do you remember when Jesus in Matthew 17 took 3 of his disciples and went up on what became the Mount of Transfiguration? Do you remember 2 Old Testament characters appeared? Elijah and Moses. What did they talk about? Well, Luke tells us. They talked about what is clearly the central event of human history. The atonement. Christ's impending offering of himself. Think of all of the doctrines that are of significance. What about world evangelism? What about how husband and wife ought to treat each other? How to raise your children? What about, from a Christian perspective, the Lord's Supper? And on we could go. There's a lot of critical doctrines. But you would put prayer, by the way, singing. We would say singing is important. There's a lot in the New Testament about proper singing, what to sing, how to sing. But prayer, so you go into the presence of God and that's the topic? That does not square, in my mind, with the nature of God and the nature of godly religion. Let alone the fact that God would enjoin upon people something that is really unrealistic. No, by the way, you've already thought in your mind, this sounds like the conversation that Abraham had with God at Sodom. But notice the difference. That was not over some doctrinal matter or anything. That was over whether God chose to take a certain action in history and time against people. God has many different ways He can go to accomplish His purpose. Remember that? I mean, that's God. Like Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go, so they can go and leave and come and worship me. And if he says no, then do this, and he'll still let them go. I mean, either way, I'm going to work this out. But my actions will be based upon their actions. That's God. That's His nature. So that's going on with Abraham and this conversation with God, but that's not what this is. This is more equivalent to God saying, all right, in order for me to accept a person, they are going to have to be immersed in H2O. Won't accept them without it. Then He comes back and says, well, okay, I'll allow if you'll just come in contact with water. You could sprinkle it or pour it. That'll be okay. Well, okay, then I'll... Do you see what I'm saying? God wouldn't do that. God knew ahead of time, if He's eternal and omniscient, He knew whether it would be 50 or 5. Why go through that? Why enjoin something on people that He then takes back and says, okay, I'm not going to enjoin that upon you? Seems to me that just does not fit the nature of God. All right, the three most holy sites of Islam: Mecca, where Muhammad was born; Medina, where he moved, fled, and where he is buried; and then what is clearly the third most holy shrine of Islam, the Dome of the Rock, because of this critical event in Islamic thinking. All right, all of this material is available. David has told you that you can get a free DVD. Now, all of that's preparatory, all that's just background. I just wanted to orient you as to what Islam is. Tomorrow night's the critical night. Because to determine the authenticity of any religion, let's be honest and fair and objective. To determine the authenticity of any religion, you have to determine whether its source of authority possesses proof that it's from God. That's what we claim about Christianity. If you could prove the Bible has contradictions and it's man-made, well, Christianity's gone. I mean, it would be a foolish religion, even if it has good attributes, which all religions do. But it would discredit it as being of divine origin. That's the case with many religions. If you could go through the Hindu Vedas and ascertain whether or not God would say and do this. Is this consistent with infinity, with deity? Can we do that? Do we have that capability is the question. If we don't have that ability, then forget it. Why are you even here tonight? Just give it up and do what you want to do. Live how you want to live. But if there is a God, and if He has communicated to human beings and given them certain information that He's going to hold them accountable for, even determine their eternal destiny based on that information, then we as human beings, with reasonable intelligence, have the capability of putting books on the table and determining, well, which ones are actually from God. We can do that. So tomorrow evening, I believe I'm going to provide you with proof positive in sorting out this matter. All right. Time for a Q&A. I don't know if you're able to write anything down. If you want to bring a microphone, these fellows will pick up anything you've written down But if you haven't and you don't get to it, then... I didn't bring my glasses up here. Here is one. How widespread is the practice of polygamy in the Muslim world? It is extremely widespread, even in our own country. You thought about that? They're just legally identifying one as the legal wife on the books, and the other women are living with it, which fits right in with American culture these days. Do you realize how serious this is? I mean, as we see the breakdown of our civilization, come on, how many of you are old enough? Let's say you're 50 years old. So when you were 15 years old, if in the town where you grew up, someone was engaging in polygamy, or don't even call it that, a man was just living with several women, what would have happened? That's been dealt with seriously in our country from day one. Do you know what happened in the late 1800s when, 1830 was when Joseph Smith claims that God enabled him to discover the plates, which was then translated into the Book of Mormon, 1830. Well, within 15 years, they believed that God told them that men are to start having multiple wives, and I mean no limit. Brigham Young supposedly had like 15 or 20. Well, do you remember that they endured such persecution that they moved to the main body, not all of them, but the main body moved to Utah. And it wasn't too long that Utah and Idaho territories, U.S. territories, began to petition our government for statehood. Any of you remember what the response was? Not going to happen. Not as long as you're practicing polygamy. You ought to go read the United States Supreme Court cases in the late 1800s. Of course, the government eventually threatened the entire Mormon church and said, we are going to literally shut you down if you do not publicly and formally repudiate this. That is historical fact. And the Mormon documents where the president explains to the entire church, here's why we're stopping this, because we believe that there are other rituals like baptism for the dead that merit continuation. So we're willing to sacrifice this in order to do that. That's what they say. They believe God approved of that change. But those court cases literally threatened the population of those territories, saying, number one, you can't vote even in the territorial people could still vote. They couldn't vote. They had to take an oath before, when they went into the polling center, you had to take an oath. I repudiate the Book of Mormon, the church's position on polygamy, or you were not allowed to vote. Can you imagine that flying today? There'd be all kinds of outrage over that. And when you read these court cases, these justices, they had their heads on straight. They said, the very basis and foundation of Western civilization, let alone the American Republic, is the family consisting of one man and one woman. On this, one can easily say that all of society depends upon this. And it wasn't just one of them that said that. That was the common view of the average rank-and-file American. So, separate and apart from all the other issues with Islam, are they violent? Are they wanting to kill us? And blah, blah, blah. Forget all that. To allow a religion to come into our country and to impart so-called equal rights and toleration when they have as one of their foundational concepts a distortion of the home as God Himself set it up at the very beginning of human history, is ultimately to spell the death knell of our nation. That's going to take us down just on that one issue alone, if we don't get serious about what needs to be done with it. What is the difference between Islam and the Nation of Islam? Okay, the Nation of Islam was started back in the 1920s, 30s, by Elijah Muhammad. And I'm not just real well versed on this, but I don't think I'll say anything that's in error. He kind of started that religion as essentially a rejection of Christianity and a rebellion against the status quo religion of America, because he felt it was the white man's religion. And he felt it was used in history as an oppressor of African Americans. And therefore he launched that concept through that religion. And you've noticed Farrakhan and others that are outspoken individuals today that are associated with the Nation of Islam still make that point. He's not saying anything that wasn't already said before. Remember, Malcolm X got involved in that. And he came out of it because he realized, this isn't really even Islam, because it's doing things and saying things that don't fit. He even made a trip to Mecca and kind of had a conversion experience and came back and basically announced, I don't subscribe to that anymore. And they killed him. He was assassinated. So I believe if you ask a traditional Orthodox Muslim, they would say that the Nation of Islam does not really represent what we conceive to be Islam, although there are a lot of tangents and connections. Now, speak to me afterwards if you think I've misrepresented it, because I'm always open to being taught where I have been misinformed. Are God and Allah the same? Muslims say yes. Allah of the Quran is the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham. It's the same God. Absolutely. But I contend that just because a person produces a book and talks about a certain character like God or Christ, that therefore it's the same being. Now, let me give you an example. There are a lot of books now on the market by Christian authors that depict Jesus in a way that is contradictory to the Jesus you read about in the New Testament. For example, the title of the book, In the Grip of Grace. I don't even have to open the book to know that's a misrepresentation of Jesus. So see, he's characterizing Jesus to people. He's painting a portrait of Jesus that does not square with the Jesus that you read about in the New Testament. And that's my contention about Allah. The Allah of the Quran says and does things that the God of the Bible would not say or do. So, do they intend for it to be the same character? Yes. But is he actually characterized and conceptualized differently than the God of the Bible? I would say he is. And in that sense is not the same God. All right, since I don't have my glasses up here, I'm going to have to go with the people that write big. How do they justify murder? Well, I'm going to show you passages from the Quran, if not tomorrow night, Sunday morning, that talk about the fact that, when you oppose Allah, then you constitute a threat and you're an kafir, an infidel. Most religions of the world, including Christianity, have killed people that oppose whoever the person is that does the killing, right? Look at Ireland, the Protestant and Catholic war that's gone on there for how long? They're killing each other, bombs and everything. Look at all of the claims in human history from so-called Christian, claim to be Christianity, that have instituted all sorts of heinous things, from the Spanish Inquisition to a host of other occasions where, in the name of Christ, people have been killed and so forth. Well, that's not the issue. The issue is, are they representing Christianity accurately? Now, Judaism, there was a period there where God informed the Jewish nation, you are to go in and wipe out entire civilization. But the Bible gives the exact reason why. And the only authority they had to do that was God told them, this is appropriate for you to do this. But Christianity, God's never said that in Christianity. Jesus never encouraged his apostles, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and baptized will be saved. He who does not believe, take them out. That's just not Christianity. By the way, that's not God. Think about it. God created human beings, imparted to them certain features, characteristics, attributes that are divine. That is, we were made in His image. What does that mean? It doesn't mean physically we appear like Him. That means we have certain qualities and attributes that are a part of the Spirit, God. Well, one of those is we are free will, free moral agents. That's part of our nature. God created us that way. He allows us to exercise volition. Now, He says there will be a day of reckoning at the end of time, but in the meantime, God doesn't step in and stop us from making our decisions. Oh, there are immediate consequences from our own actions. But God is not coercive like that, but Allah is. That's a different God. So a person really needs to sit down and just evaluate the very nature of God. Would He insist that you put together armies and then begin moving across the world and bring everybody in submission forcibly? See, that very concept strikes against the nature of God. You know, if God wanted to do that, He just would have created everybody robots in the first place, make them all believers. That doesn't make sense. The very nature of man demands that people be allowed to make their own decisions and then live it out, even if it harms others. What's the significance of the prayer rugs? I can't answer that. I've never encountered that. I just thought it was so you have something to put your knees on because you're going to get down on the ground. There was a lady at Walmart recently that I was made aware of, and you know, that's hard pavement and so forth. There may be some more significance, but I'm not aware of it if it is. All right, let me put these on. Look closely at these, by the way. Take them apart. You do this. Now that's distracting, and you're not going to be able to listen to me until I explain this. They're called Click. So go on, Google them, Click, and you get your own. They're magnifiers, or you can get regular glasses. The $1 ones I was getting from Dollar Tree, and I'll hang them here and hang them there, and they break and everything else. So I finally got these. All right, have you received a lot of negative attention for speaking for Christianity and against other religions? Not as much as you would think. There have been those who have attended my seminars that, are Muslims, and so they don't agree with me, but so far they've all been cordial. And you're right that just the idea of an American speaking against another religion is politically incorrect. And I know there'd be a lot of people upset with me. I ventured on the airplane sitting next to a flight attendant who was in between or where she was going. And I told her what I was doing, and she hesitated. I thought, oh boy, here it comes. Oh, you're intolerant. That's the big word, right? And no, she was very pleased and didn't have any problem. But there is a sizable segment of our community that would say you should not speak against other views. That's not right. You need to be tolerant and celebrate diversity. Well, folks, honestly, I would be happy to do that if I thought it pleased God. The most intolerant, judgmental being in all of human history is God Himself. He's intolerant when it comes to error, to that which is contrary to His nature and His will. And if we didn't have the Bible to guide us through all of that, then I would be perfectly willing to say, you know what, it really doesn't matter what you believe and all the religions. I may not particularly personally like some features of some religions, but I have to admit that that's just my opinion, and everybody ought to be able to do and believe what they want. That is not the God of the Bible. That's not part of the nature of deity. And it's incredible to me that the founders of our civilization, whatever their issues, whatever their imperfections, they understood the only way our civilization can even exist, even be set up to begin with, let alone last, is if it has a common language and a common religion. And they allowed a lot of diversity under the umbrella of Christianity. They called them sects and denominations. But they said, at least we all understand the same God and the same religion and the same book. They all believed, well, not all of them, but maybe 5 or 10 of them. All the rest of them said the Bible, meaning Old and New Testament, they said that, is the Word of God, the inspired Word of God. There's a heaven and there's a hell. There was unanimity almost among the mass of founders. And they said it's got to be that way to set up the kind of country we are. If you want to have this kind of country with this kind of freedom and potential for advancement and progress and prosperity, it's got to be that way. Well, I think that they were representing things correctly in terms of the priority and the essentiality of Christianity. Do you want me to keep going? Okay. Some Muslims believe that Muhammad is the last prophet. Shouldn't they still follow the Testament now? And my glasses didn't help. And how we do instead of how they do today. Should we still follow the Testament and worship how we do instead of how they do? Well, they believe that, yes, the Bible, which, by the way, is spoken of in the Quran. They believe that the Bible was originally the Word of God, yes. But it's been corrupted over time. And we'll respond to that tomorrow evening. What I probably won't say tomorrow evening is, apart from the issue of whether it's been corrupted, that's a misunderstanding of even the very nature of the Bible. When Muslims say that, I know they've never read it. Because what Muhammad should have done in the Quran is said, he should have come right out and said either that the Bible was never the Word of God, it's always been a man-made fiction, or he should have said it has been thoroughly corrupted to where it's of no value. You need to go solely by the Quran. Now, the Quran sends mixed signals. Sometimes it speaks highly of this previous revelation. Sometimes it acts as if it's been the Jews and Christians have not lived up to it. But the average Muslim is going to say, no, there's a lot of good stuff there that's still good, but it's been corrupted. Well, no, it hasn't. And we can prove it hasn't. So, man, these books clash big time, and I'll show you that tomorrow night. The mosque, the Dome of the Rock didn't have the minarets. I think there's one situated beside it. I'd have to go back and look at that, but that's a good point. Even though it is a mosque, it's not a mosque in the traditional sense in that it is designed for that singular purpose or primary purpose of being the place from which he made his trip to heaven. Last two here. Were all rituals in Islam established during Muhammad's lifetime or established over time by other rulers? If there are any, change that. If there are any rituals established by others, I'm not aware of them, and they're certainly not given the credibility and the credence that these others are. These others, so far as I know, came during the lifetime of Muhammad as he was over this 23-year period that he was claiming to receive revelations. Elaborate on jihad's connection to Islam and Muslims. Come back tomorrow night, I'm going to go into that into great detail. Is the Islam Brotherhood in Egypt Shiite or Sunni? I'm not sure about that. I can't answer that. See, that's another very confusing thing about Islam. You've got all these groups, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and so forth. And there's no question in my mind that they, their organization, their leaders, they may whip them up and maybe not represent mainstream Islam. That's a possibility. I could see where that could be the case. They're like the more fanatical people. No religion has ever managed to make the majority of its adherents what you would call very dedicated, on fire, and faithful, right? I mean, every congregation I've ever been connected with is that way. The majority are not. But see, the problem with Islam is that even those that have embraced it, but they're kind of westernized and they're not too tied to it, they're nevertheless maintaining that association. And if a radical element were to gain control of a country, as we're seeing happening in some of these countries, well, the rest of the Muslim population falls into line. So it does no good for us to say, well, that's the radical minority. Most of them are not that way. Well, right, they're not marching in the streets or anything, but they are supportive of all of this. They certainly won't buck it. They won't oppose it. Well, we have proof of that. Look how many things have happened in our country. By the way, way before 9/11. How many terrorist acts have been made on our ships and our military facilities overseas, our ambassador, what do you call them, our what? Yeah, those places. And how often have we heard even a few, let alone the Islamic world, rise up and condemn that as non-Islamic? Have you ever heard that done? I'd really like to know. And even when people get on our news and everything and say that, we never hear you all denouncing this. Quiet as the tomb. Now, what's going on there? Because we don't have any hesitation denouncing all kinds of things around the world. Probably some things we shouldn't be denouncing. So my fear is, and I'm going to show you, that the Quran is decisive on this. Not a matter of interpretation. It's decisive. All right, y'all have been so kind to bear with me for so long. So, how are we going to end? Dan, thank you for your attention tonight. Please come back tomorrow night, and please invite people to come with you. Let's study this together. I'm trying not to be unkind or offensive. Honestly, I am. But I hold strong feelings about these matters. And so, please don't take it as trying to offend or be unkind. I'm honestly trying to give a fair, unbiased analysis of these concepts.